Welcome to our session today, Mahayana Buddhism, What's Great About the Great Vehicle. As always, it's really lovely to see everyone. Yeah, I say that every week, but genuinely, it's such a good time for me to disconnect and from life and use this time to reset. And I hope that can be the same for you too today. Today we have the wonderful Jonathan Shearman to speak with us a bit about Jonathan. His journey with Dharma goes back to a visit to Sri Lanka as a child in 1960s, where an encounter with Buddhist monastics left a strong impression. He attended several retreats at Wat Buddha Dharma, formerly took refuge in July 2007, went on to his first 10-day Vipassana retreat in early 2008. In the years past, he has given courses in Buddhism at Warunga and Mossman Evening College. He has completed a Master of Buddhist Studies course at the University of Sydney. So this will be a well-researched talk on Mahayana Buddhism. For those of you who's not as familiar with this branch of Buddhism, its teachings are based on the early teachings of Buddhism, as well as various new doctrines and texts such as the Mahayana Sutras and the Bodhisattva path, which I'm sure Jonathan will talk a little bit more about. This is also the branch of Buddhism that Zen and Tibetan Buddhism belongs to. And if you have any questions, please feel free to pop it in the chat function there. We'll have time for questions at the end. And over to you, Jonathan.
Okay, thanks for that wonderful intro. Yes, my background, I don't see myself as Dharma teacher. Like, I'm very much Dharma student. And I got very interested in the subject, because it seemed to be the most coherent kind of world picture of all the various world teachings. That's what led me to study it. But I think this session probably is quite academic. So by all means, stop and ask questions if you want to. It's hard for me sometimes to imagine or picture it at the right level for everybody, because we all bring our own perspectives and interests to it. And a lot of this material I gathered during the time I did that degree at University of Sydney, which really I just did for the interest and love of the subject. So yeah, stop me to ask questions if I'm going too quickly, or if I'm introducing things you really don't get, by all means. So what is great about the great vehicle? You might sometimes hear this term Mahayana Buddhism. And obviously we're probably all familiar with the other school. Usually the way it's divided up in this day and age is the Mahayana. In fact, I've got the next slide. Oop, how do I go backwards? This one. Yes, very good. This is like a map of the Buddhist world from a standard text. And if you look carefully at it, the heartland is that red orange dot in the very middle. That's where the Buddha lived and taught for most of his lifetime. And then Buddhism, subsequent to the Buddha's parinirvana, disseminated through various trade routes across the ancient world. Towards the left-hand side, looking at the screen where it says Bactria, Afghanistan, and Gandhara. Actually, Gandhara was a very early center of Buddhist culture. You may remember that actually pretty sad story of the Bamiyan Buddhas, which were demolished by the Taliban in the early 2000s. So the massive 103-foot high sandstone sculptures that had been carved into a cliff, and they were blown up by the Taliban in early 2000s because, of course, as far as the Taliban were concerned, they were pagan idols. But that gives you an idea of how that region was really like a center of Buddhist culture in very ancient times. And in fact, if you watch news nowadays, you'll often hear references to Kandahar province in Afghanistan. Usually it's in the news because there's been some fighting there, but in actual fact, Kandahar is the modern version of the word Gandhara, which was an ancient Buddhist kingdom. So that's the ancient Buddhist world expanded to that's the east, then to the west, where it expanded in Tibet, China, and Mongolia. So the orange part really is like, on the top right is the Mahayana world, so to speak. And yes, that's right. And then Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Thailand, and Myanmar, Burma, which is the moment is going through very hard times. They are the center of the Theravada world. So the first thing I want to talk a little about is the distinction between these two branches or schools, because it's a bit, Buddhism is not a simple story the way it unfolds. Now, this is the Gandari scroll evidence. there was this great discovery in the late part of the, when was it? I think it was about the 1960s, 70s. There was a whole bunch of ancient scrolls turned up on a village marketplace in Kandahar, Afghanistan region. These were the very earliest Buddhist scriptures. And there was a fellow who basically somebody bought them in the marketplace and then recognized that they were really important because they seem to be very ancient. They seem to be in a script that nobody was familiar with. And they contacted an expert at the University of Washington, I believe, by the name of Richard Salaman, who found out that these were the earliest scripts, written scripts of the Buddhist faith. They're actually a lot older than the Pali canon. And they're written in a language which is not Pali. It's an early dialect. I don't know all the details of what it's called, but they deciphered a number of these, like I think 70 or 80 of these. They're called the London Museum Scrolls of Buddhism over the period of about 20 or 30 years. And it gave a really good insight into the very earliest Buddhist scriptures. And it actually changed the understanding of how Buddhism evolved and developed. So I'll do a brief recap of the story for those who are new to Buddhism of how Buddhism did preserve itself and how the teachings were transmitted. Immediately after the Buddha's, what they say, the Buddha's parinirvana, passing into the ultimate nirvana, there was a council of the monastic followers called. They all sat together and they essentially recited the Buddha's teachings. This is according to lore and legend. So this is the first Buddhist council. The Buddha's faithful assistant, Ananda, was the one who remembered the most of the teachings. He had a photographic memory, so he was able to recollect them. And he essentially recited all of Buddha's words. And I think they gathered together for 60 or 80 days. And they didn't, in those days, this was pre-script. They didn't write any of it. They memorized it. Because you've got to remember in ancient India, they already had the Vedic culture where all of the scriptures were handed down from generation to generation by memorization. It was a completely oral culture. It is hard for us to imagine today how you could transmit these vast amounts of information just by memorizing it, but that is what the ancient cultures did. So this was probably, they say the Buddha's lifetime was in 400 or 500 BC, before Christ, but now they call it the Common Era, because BC is obviously Christian terminology, but it's about 460 years BC that they actually committed all of this teachings to memory. So these scripts that we're looking at actually come from about the 3rd or 2nd century BC, which is very early. It's really only a few hundred years after the Buddha's parinirvana. So at the stage the Buddha's teaching was codified, it was turned into what was called the basket of teachings, Tipitaka. First of all, there was the sayings of the Buddha, which is the sutta in Pali. And then second of all, there was the monastic rules, which are the Vinaya, of which I think there's something in the vicinity of 256 for men and 277 for women. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. Then later on, as the tradition developed, a third basket of teachings also developed called the Abhidharma, which were the philosophical and psychological texts which supported the teachings. So these scriptures that they were found in Gandara, in what is now Afghanistan, what used to be ancient Gandara, were the very first forms of the Buddhist teachings that had been committed to script. And it was actually, it overturned a lot of what had been thought. The way that Buddhism, the history of Buddhism is often taught is that the original Pali texts are the most faithful representation of the original Buddhist teachings. They're the ones nearest to what the Buddha actually spoke, as recorded by Ananda and his immediate disciples after his death. But when they found these scriptures, they found that actually there were quite a few discrepancies in the way the texts were presented. I mean, it wasn't grossly different, but there were subtle differences between different versions of how the story was told and different groups of lists, different orders of the material. So this is where originally, when I went to university and studied these things first in about the 1970s or 80s, everybody said, well, first of all, there was something like the early Buddhist texts, and then the Mahayana movement, which we're talking about, grew out of that several hundred years later as like an evolution or a development. But when these Gandari scripts were found, it was actually discovered that some of the ideas that would become the Mahayana actually were there right from the very beginning. So this was a picture from an article that was published in Tricycle magazine. If you don't know Tricycle, it's a really excellent online and print magazine for Buddhist scholarship, meditation practice, Buddhist culture. This article goes back to, well, it's about 10 years ago. So on the left-hand side, you see what originally it was felt there was this kind of central stream of the teaching as recorded faithfully by Ananda, the first disciples, which then branched out into all of these various schools. But after getting these Gandhara texts and translating them, they realized that there was actually a lot more complicated than that. Because there were quite a few schools right from the beginning, which had, and as I said, they're not radically different, like nothing overturns the basic principles of Buddhism but it makes it a lot less clear that there was like an original, simple, pure doctrine, which is something that Theravada like to present themselves as, like the custodians of the original, and that the Mahayana was this later development. Well, no, it was actually found it was more like the case that there were these various interpretations which had been preserved by memory, by recitation, and then as the art of writing gradually developed over the centuries, they were written down in separate centres by separate scribes and separate scholars, and they all had slightly separate characteristics, which is quite an interesting story in its own right, because that article, if you ever find it, it's actually you can find it on Linda Human's website, Whose Buddhism is Truest. And if Tina has a Metta Centre site, I'll put up a copy of this presentation up later as like a PDF with these links on it for anybody who wants to follow up. She goes into that whole story of the discovery. So now this next slide, don't ask, I won't recite all the details, it's got a lot of detail. But basically after the first council, which goes back to around the 400 BC mark as far as history can determine, because a lot of these facts are pretty slippery, there was a second council whereby the monastic order had grown in the first several hundred years of Buddhism. Buddhism as a movement grew tremendously on the Indian subcontinent. I mean, you've got to realize that when the Buddha started teaching, he began with 5 disciples, the original 5 who he taught at the Deer Park at Benares. And then he taught for 43 years. He walked the roads of northwestern India, talking to everyone who came to him, you know, princes and poor people and soldiers and generals and anybody who approached him with questions he would answer. And during this time, the movement started to grow exponentially, and it grew tremendously in the first few hundred years, such that by the time of the second council, they needed to revisit some of the principles, thrash out some points of doctrine that had become the source of dispute. So I'll just show you without much further ado. This is where the original, what is thought to be the origin of the Mahayana movement began. So what there was said to have been a dispute amongst the monastic orders about some of the rules of the Vinaya, which is the monastic order. Specifically, I think one of them, which is generally understood to be historic, was whether the monks were allowed to carry money or not. Originally, in the setting that the Buddha taught in, it was a very primitive agrarian society, and you've got to realise at the time, 400 or 500 BC, in India and elsewhere, it was the very origin of civilization. And the Buddhist movement was a renunciate movement, which was based in the forest, and they had no need for money because they would beg for alms, and the economic model was that the monks would be provided with alms and they would provide spiritual sustenance to the populace. But as the Buddhist movement expanded along the ancient Silk Route and went further afield, it became necessary to start carrying money. So this is one of the disputes. Well, it wasn't a dispute so much, it was a matter of interpreting the doctrine and trying to understand whether it was permissible under certain circumstances. But this is one of the how shall we say, disagreements that broke out in the Sangha as to the monastic rules. There were several others, which I won't go into all the details now. But on the right-hand side, you see a group called the Mahasamgika. And in Pali and Sanskrit, that Maha is great, as in great vehicle, and Sangha is basically the great Sangha. So the majority view on the right-hand side, and the Svabhidavada said they were representing the tradition. So it was a split between, to put it in modern terms, progressive and conservative. interpretations. And then these developed through this, as I say, it's a very complicated slide, this one. Don't ask me to give you the details of all of these schools. But you can see there, I'll stop at this point because on the very left-hand side, you see the emergence of the Theravada. So the Theravada is still the dominant school of Buddhism in Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Thailand, and Myanmar to this day. And Theravada means, Thera is elder and Vada is way. So Theravada is the way of the elders, doctrine of the elders. And so they're the custodians of the Buddhist teaching and the Buddhist way of life, which is still conducted. In fact, I read recently that the Buddhist monastic order is the longest existing organisation of any kind in the world today, in that it's existed continuously from that time, with essentially the same rules and the same outlook since the time of the Buddha, and it still does. So that's where the Theravada appears to modernity. So Theravada right till now. A lot of these other schools that came over the, in the centuries in the meantime are now sort of lost to history. Many of them are only known to Buddhist scholars. God, this is some slide, isn't it? Then the Mahasamgika side on the right gave rise to all of these other interpretations and schools of Buddhism. I think what I learned at Buddhist studies was that the way Buddhism developed, there was a lot of emphasis on individual teachers who were particularly eloquent or charismatic or capable of imparting the true essence of the Buddhist teachings. Many of these schools are named after particular magnetic individuals who taught the Buddhist way over those centuries, or under principles. They're named after principles of the teaching. So all of these schools developed over the period of several hundred years after the Buddha's parinirvana. So there was a real kind of foment of us not competing in interpretations, and we'll go into that a little. It wasn't like the schism in some of the schisms in other religions where there's these absolute divorces, but they just saw things in slightly different perspectives. And so then all of these ones that have got asterisks on them are all contributed to the rise of what's called Mahayana Buddhism. So by the time all of these movements had become established, this is still in the BC. It's like around the time of the life of Jesus Christ in the West, or in the Middle East. And this is when the first inklings of what's called the Mahayana started to emerge. Is that okay so far? No questions? All good? So scholars generally put down the origin of the Mahayana to this emergence of this group that called themselves the Mahasamgika, the Great Assembly, which they arose, as we saw, partly over a liberalisation of rules concerning carrying money, which started to become a practical necessity when these monks were travelling, in distant lands and having to cross borders. They were no longer supported by a sort of a community or a society which understood the role of the monks and would just automatically turn up and feed them every day. There was also this, and this is one of the important things that comes up with the Mahayana, there was a resentment that the monastic, the salvation or nirvana was only a real possibility for the members of the monastic order. So the whole culture and society were supporting the monks, and the monks themselves were the only ones who really were seen as having the opportunity to realise the ultimate fruits of the Buddhist path. There was very restricted, or sort of a restricted role for the lay community, for the virtuous layperson. What more could they do but support the monks? So that was another source of contention in the order. And that was one of the reasons that the Mahasamgika started to sort of articulate a different model of the Buddhist faith. So these are some of the teachings that are associated with this Mahasamgika. Now, I suppose this is where it gets a bit dense. It's a pretty dense slide, this slide. There is such a thing as death by PowerPoint. So rather than read all through it, I'll say a few things in a more general way about how the Buddha was understood by the two different kinds of wings of Buddhism at that time. The Theravada view is very much that the Buddha was a I suppose, a perfected being. There's actually a scriptural passage where a man asked the Buddha, "Who are you? Are you a god?" "No, I'm not a god." "Are you a yaksa?" A yaksa is a type of deity. "No, I'm not a deity." "Are you a human?" And telling me, he says, "No, I'm not human, not a human." "Then what are you?" "I am Buddha. I'm awakened. I'm the awakened one." So he's not in any of those categories that at the time that he was not one of the Hindu gods and he didn't want to be seen as a god. He wasn't a god, wasn't like a demigod or a deity or a powerful demon or anything else. He was the awakened one. But in some ways, in the original Buddhism, the Buddha was still very much one individual teacher. And there was the memory of and the worship of that teacher and the teaching. Whereas the Mahasamgika started to sort of idealize the Buddha as being something, how should we say, I don't like to say more than human, but something nearer to a deity, we would say. So the Buddhas, plural, and that's another thing which is different, because already we're starting to talk about the Buddhas as being more than one, are above the world, supramundane, which means they're elevated above mundus, this ordinary world that all of us beings are in. They're devoid of outflows, and they have no worldly kind of attachments, whatever. All of their words turn the wheel of Dharma, and they can express all of the teaching of the Buddha in a single sound. So here you start to see this transition of the Buddha from being, in some ways, a kind of almost like a humanistic type of ascetic philosophy to more like a universal type of religious claim. They never say a word because they're always in samadhi, but beings thinking that they utter words jump for joy. This is actually taken from the Mahasamgika scriptures. There's a big list of them. You can find them, like everything nowadays, you can find it all online. In a single moment of thought, the Buddhas comprehend all dharmas. So they understand everything there is to be understood in any instant of thought. There are Buddhas everywhere in the four directions. And the bodhisattvas start to emerge as an alternative to, as an alternative to the arahat. So I should say something there a little bit about the bodhisattva and the arahat. So just as in the original, or shall we say the early Buddhist texts, the ideal figure was the Buddha, who was the perfected one. And the arahat was the individual monk, male or female, who had realized the supreme enlightenment and in a sense was on a par with the Buddha, but the Buddha was always regarded as unique because he alone had realized the truth by himself. That's, I think, the meaning of Sama Sambuddhasa. So whereas these arhats who realized this highest truth through following the Buddhist path weren't on the same level as Buddha, but they essentially realized this, had a similar realization, or they emulated that realization, which gave them the status or the station of arahat, which means a perfected one who will not be reborn again. And the supreme aim of the Buddhist path was to reach that state of there was a classification. There were once returners who were identified as those who were destined to return once more. There were anagamans who were destined to return no more than 7 times. And there were never returners who I think were classified as the arahat. And they had transcended the eternal realm of transmigration and for once and for all, broken all of their bonds. So that is the ideal of the arahat. And that was very much the central focus of the early Buddhist texts and the original Buddhist movement. But now we come across this term, bodhisattva, which is much more associated with, you'll hear it associated more with Tibetan Buddhism. You don't hear it as much associated with the Theravada teaching. But it should be said, the bodhisattva in Pali is bodhisatta, is also present throughout those early Buddhist texts as a type, like an archetype, I suppose you might say. But in the early Buddhist texts, the Bodhisattva was the individual Gautama, Siddhartha, Buddha, in his previous lives. So there's a beautiful set of literature called the Jataka stories, which are the stories of the Buddha's many lives before his enlightenment, in which he invariably appears as an heroic figure, often as an animal of some kind, like a creature who sacrifices him or herself for the benefit of others. So that figure is a bodhisattva, and a bodhisattva is a wisdom. Literally, body means wisdom. Body is wisdom, and sattva is being. So bodhisattva or bodhisattva is a wisdom being. So the distinction between the bodhisattva and the arahat started to become articulated by this Mahasamgika movement. And the difference was that because the bodhisattvas wished to help beings become perfect, they vowed to be reborn again, instead of just escaping into nirvana and disappearing off the cycle of things. So this is where you start to see the origin of the real Mahayana teachings, the figure of the bodhisattva. So after the Mahasamgika, and as I say, it's very hard to establish like precise timelines, because the only real archaeological evidence, apart from those very fragmentary early texts, are inscriptions, some temple inscriptions and iconography, sculpture and so forth. So it's quite hard to, I mean, for example, unlike the Chinese, who had these assiduous methods of record keeping, where the Mandarins would keep records of all kinds of things that happened. And so the Chinese historical records go back thousands of years, and you can identify all kinds of happenings in the rise and fall of kingdoms. There was not quite the same degree of clarity about early Buddhism, because it was early civilization and things they didn't leave a lot of records. But they think that this Mahayana teaching started to gel around what's called the Krishna River, or possibly in Gandari, which we looked at before, in the northwestern part of what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan. And they started to crystallize around these beautiful set of texts called the Prajnaparamita scriptures. Now, these actually go back to very early days. And I think the timelines are the very first Prajnaparamita scriptures are recognized as being around the time that Jesus lived in Palestine. So even though the Mahayana itself did not become very well established for quite a few hundred years after that, some of these very early texts go back to these pretty ancient times, which is several, like probably 400 or 500 years, 4 or 5 centuries after the Buddha's parinirvana, and the Buddhist order had been in circulation all of that time. These Prajnaparamita texts begin to appear. And these are the texts that are most clearly associated with the Mahayana movement. So a couple of things. First of all, for those who are new to Buddhism, in the Theravada countries we talked about, which once again, it's Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia to some extent, and Myanmar, Burma, they're centered around a particular set of texts, which are the representation of the Buddha's words, Buddha Vachana, and that is called the Tipitaka of the early Buddhist texts. In the language of Pali, Pali is a ceremonial language which is related to other Indian languages, but it's unique to Buddhist ceremonial and scriptural forms. So all the Theravada tradition have Pali scriptures, which are now written in various scripts, including a lot of them have been translated into English. And they are called collectively the Nikayas or the Agamas of, depending on which part of the world you're in, of the early Buddhist texts. So when the Mahayana begins to appear, alongside the Mahayana, there's a whole, how shall we say, there's a new form of Buddhist scripture that starts to appear, which are these Prajnaparamita sutras. So in the Pali text, which belong to the Theravada, we have the suttas. And if you read the suttas, they are said to be verbatim reports of the dialogues of the Buddha, either with his disciples or with other people who come and ask him questions. And the Buddhist sutras, the Mahayana sutras, are in a very similar style, but according to the Theravada, they've been, how shall we say, composed by the Mahayana. So this is where you start to see the real distinction between the Mahayana and Theravada worlds. The Theravada don't actually recognize that the Mahayana sutras are an authentic part of the Buddhist canon. And so the Mahayana, on the other hand, say that these texts express the true meaning of the Buddha's teaching. They also say that in some cases they receive them from the Buddha, as the Buddha is no longer seen as being the individual human form of Buddha, but as being like this cosmic Buddha who transcends life and death. Then the Mahayana say that they are capable of receiving these teachings outside, strictly speaking, the lifespan of Siddhartha Gautama. So the Buddha is communicating, if you like, on a higher plane, and that's what these texts represent. So I'll leave you to make up your minds as to whether you believe that or not, accept it or not. It's, as I say, still contentious in the Buddhist world, to the extent that the Theravada don't necessarily recognize the provenance of the Mahayana sutras. But in all of the northern Buddhist lands, China, Japan, Tibet, and everywhere else where Buddhism has traveled, then the Mahayana sutras are also regarded as the bona fide authentic teaching of the Buddha. That's where the distinction comes in. Now, the other point at that very bottom point is that the Mahayana sutras appear in the language of Sanskrit. So Sanskrit and Pali are very close. I've actually studied both of them, which is about the most difficult thing I've ever done. Because they're written in, well, Pali is written in English script, but the Sanskrit's written in the same script as modern Hindi, and it takes, unless you're a language whiz, really is a difficult thing to learn. But they're very similar languages, but they have subtle and important differences. The point about the Sanskrit language was it was the language of the educated elite, of the priestly class and the Brahmins. The Buddha always insisted in teaching in the vernacular language, which is basically speaking the language of the common people. I think there was a language called Magadha, which he is thought to have spoken, although of course it wasn't written down for centuries afterwards, so it's never entirely clear. But the reason the scholars think that the Mahayana sutras were composed in Sanskrit is by this time Buddhism had become quite ascendant in India, and in order to really compete at the court level and to seek royal patronage and to debate with the Brahmins and to really become part of Indian culture, they had to actually use the lingua franca, which was Sanskrit. And so all of the original Mahayana sutras were composed in or presented in Sanskrit. The Mahayana would not say they were composed, they would say they were received, but they were expressed in Sanskrit. So this is a textbook entry, and I will leave that on the screen for a minute and let you read it while I have a glass of water. It's by a fellow called Shtabatsky, who was a Russian scholar in the middle of the 19th century, early 20th century, who, when we see a non-theistic, soul-denying philosophic teaching of a path to personal final deliverance, comprising an absolute end, and a simple worship of the memory of a human founder, superseded by a magnificent high church for the supreme being, surrounded by a pantheon of celestial beings, a religion highly devotional, highly ceremonial, with the ideal of universal salvation of all living creatures. We are fully justified in maintaining that the history of religions has scarcely witnessed such a break between the new and old, within the pale of what, nevertheless, continues to claim common descent. So it was a big revolution inside Buddhism when this came about. And if you'd been there, which we weren't, of course, because it's 2,000 years ago, it would have really seemed like this was a sort of an upheaval in a way. There was really the emergence of this completely different kind of spirituality that came out of the Buddhist movement. I think that statement I put on the screen is a little, how shall I say, it's a bit, I don't think it's exaggerated. I just think it's the way it appeared to somebody who discovered this for the first time. And he discovered it, as I say, I think he was one of the European scholars who discovered Buddhism when it was first being re-encountered by the West. So I wanted to say a few words about this term Hinayana. Is anybody familiar with this term Hinayana? You will hear this from time to time. Sometimes it's said that the two different branches of Buddhism are Mahayana and Hinayana. There's also Vajrayana, but I won't get into that tonight. And so I thought I should say something about that, because on face value, it seems a little, how shall we say, patronizing to the Theravadins, because the word Hina means smaller or little, and Maha means great. So the Mahayana is the great vehicle, and the Hinayana is the lesser vehicle. So the reason that term was introduced is because the Mahayana, with its new ideal of the Bodhisattva and its sort of more cosmic idea of religion, wanted to differentiate itself from the doctrine of the original teaching, what they call the doctrine of the hearers. Like, the hearers are the ones who heard the Buddha's word. They're called Shravaka. And they're like, Buddhism is very big on classes, lists, categorizations, and that sort of thing. So they sort of classified, from the Mahayana perspective, they classified the original teachings as appealing to a certain, how shall we say, class of disciple, which we call the Shravaka, the ones who heard the teaching. And it's called the lesser vehicle because the aim of the Shravaka path was enlightenment for oneself and by oneself. So it was seen as being a spiritual path which is aimed at attaining the perfections of enlightenment for the individual by himself or herself. And so the aim was not, I think selfish is the wrong word, because part of the achieving of the aim is also abandonment of anything like self. But it's only concerned with the individual salvation. The Mahayana is said to be greater because its aspiration is for the enlightenment of all beings, not for oneself alone. And if you actually, quite often with Tibetan teachings and Tibetan schools, you will hear the phrase enlightenment of all beings as something which is one of the commonly expressed aspirations of Tibetan Buddhism. So it has, again, this very large kind of religious vision of the release of all sentient beings. In fact, even sentient beings way down on the evolutionary scale, who one day will be reborn in a position to benefit from the teaching. And so the aim is to make the teaching available to all sentient beings. So this is where the Bodhisattva has this greater aim in mind. So that's the context in which this distinction became made originally in the early days of Buddhism between the Mahayana and Hinayana. But generally speaking, Hinayana is not a word that is used in designating any actual Buddhist schools. I mean, I think it's wrong to describe the Theravada, which is that school that is still, representative of the early Buddhist text. I think it's disparaging to refer to them as Hinayana, even though within that sort of Buddhist categorization system, that's the way the Mahayanists would have described them. So I'm saying there, Mahayana Buddhists are encouraged to avoid using this designation. It doesn't refer to the Theravada as such. But we've seen the Theravada does not recognize the Mahayana Sutras, and the Mahayana view their own path as being of a higher or of a more noble type of aspiration than that of the Theravadins. So I've said quite a lot there, I think. Do we want to pause for questions, reflections, or anything of that kind at this point? Anything come to mind?
If you had any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or pop it in the chat. Like I just popped a question in the chat while you were talking.
Oh yeah, I see that now.
Yeah, so I was just curious to learn a bit more about the nature of Buddhas? Because it seems like a big distinction between the two traditions.
Right.
What evidence does both traditions have to support what they believe the Buddha to actually be, whether it's you enlighten, you kind of just become enlightened and kind of never come back, or you actually everywhere, like,
well, they're all working off the same texts, but you see the Buddha's teaching, when you like, even there are so many different depths and layers to it. I can't sort of, at the top of my head, I can't bring one to mind, but I could bring one to mind. Jill, can you unlock this for me now? Thanks. I'll just bring up some one example that I'm aware of. I've got two screens here because I just need to be able to look up things on one. See, in my view, a lot of what is stated by the Mahayana is they like elaborate or draw out the implications of things that were said by the Buddha and didn't seem to have been fully elaborated at the time. And I'll give you an example, actually. Let me just dash over to Access to Insight. And for those listening, if you need to read any of the Buddhist scriptures, there's a marvelous website called accesstoinsight.org, and it's got a complete set, I think it's complete, of the whole, all of the Pali texts, and it's also been replicated on one of the monks who put that together, Tanasaro Bhikkhu, has got a new version of it. But it's one of the marvelous things about today's world, the fact that we can find these resources online. So in answer to your question, one of the scriptures that became the basis for a lot of later development in Buddhism was this one called Pāvasara Sutta, Luminous Mind. And it says, luminous monks is the mind, and it is defiled by incoming defilements. Luminous monks is the mind, and it is freed from incoming defilements. Luminous monks is the mind, and it is defiled by incoming defilements. The uninstructed run-of-the-mill person doesn't discern that as it actually is present, which is why I tell you that for the uninstructed run-of-the-mill person, there is no development of the mind. They don't perceive this luminosity of mind. Luminous monks is the mind, and it is freed from incoming defilements. The well-instructed disciples of the noble ones discerns that as it actually is present, which is why I tell you that for the well-instructed disciple of the noble ones, there is development of the mind. So that's a text that became later associated with the Buddha nature schools, because it said that luminosity, which is intrinsic in the mind already to start off with, and it's only covered up by what's called adventitious defilements that creep in, that once the person or once the being recognizes the true nature of mind, then he or she realizes mind's own nature is luminous. But that was actually one of those texts that's quite hard to accommodate in the Theravada framework, because I suppose you could say it's a bit mystical. Theravadins are pretty pragmatic in their analysis, that sort of thing. And like the comment on this scripture in the Access to Insight is, this statement has been very controversial over the centuries. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that in the Buddha's teaching, and there are many, many examples that we could go and look at, where there are things that are said, they're often very brief, but they're so full of meaning, and they've got such depth that you can see the way over the intervening, the centuries that followed, there was these disputes. Well, what did he really mean by that? What was the actual inner meaning of that saying? And this happens a lot, and it was developed. And there's another one I should read to you. Actually, this is one of my very favorites, because I'll just see if I can find it. It's the Ananda Sutta. Now, I suppose to answer your question more directly, though, what evidence the Mahayana, the Theravada say that they maintain a unbroken set of verbally records that were first transmitted verbally, and then they started writing them down, and they put their own date at around, I think it's about the 2nd century AD. So it's a long time. They originally wrote them, as you know, on palm leaves. But there are, like, I think archaeological records and the Buddhist movements themselves agree that the first sets of written records of the Tipitaka go back to about the 1st or 2nd century AD. So that was a period of like 600 or 700 years after the parinirvana of the Buddha. Now, as we saw from those earlier scriptures or those findings of the Gandari birch bark, there were actually copies in circulation that were moving around the ancient Buddhist world in various scripts, and there were various declensions of them. So the Theravada like to say, well, the Pali scriptures that we have now are the most original and the nearest to the source. Well, you see, that actually has been called into question by this kind of analytical scholarship, not drastically into question. I mean, nobody's going to say there's a 5th noble truth or something like that. It's not as if it's going to upend it or something. But I think it gives, how shall we say, a bit of interpretive, there's a interpretive freedom available there, that we see that there were these different emerging types of interpretations. There are many different layers in the Buddhist teaching, and so it is possible that nobody really has the definitive and the single authoritative teaching. So I think the Theravadan teaching has got, well, look, from my viewpoint as a layperson and student of Buddhism, to me, what struck me about the Theravada text, the Pali Buddhist text, is their consistency, and the fact that the tone is so, the tone, the consistency, the concerns, the scope, all throughout, it's got a marvelous kind of integrity to it. I mean, unlike other kinds of, there's a lot of religious law and text in the world where you can see there are stories that are brought in from all different sources and things that are written in different kind of linguistic style. It's a real mishmash, whereas the Buddhist texts themselves really seem to have the imprint of a single intelligence sort of shining through it. So, and that's why also I think it has to be borne in mind, even in the Mahayana countries, all those original Pali texts, even if they've been translated to Chinese or Tibetan, they're still recognized as the core texts. But the Mahayanists will say, in addition to that, firstly, there's these other levels of interpretation, which may not have been provided by the original, like interpreters. And in fact, we do get up to that. I've got a slide about that as well. So how the early Mahayanists rely on their own. Well, I don't think that to answer your question, I don't think the Mahayanists marginalised the Nikayas so much, but they just say, well, there's other layers and other levels above and beyond them, which they recognise and which the Theravadins don't. And so, yeah, those questions you asked, how did they didn't so much turn their back on the Nikayas, but they felt as though, and here's, I should say something about the 3 turnings. I might have that somewhere. Actually, I put this slide together, but don't look at that slide at the moment because I was just going to mention something about the 3 turnings. Now, when the Prajnaparamita text started to become circulated, there's a legendary, a mythical story. There's this great Buddhist figure called Nagarjuna, which actually means the king of snakes. And Nagarjuna is another, as I say, legendary, like scholars are fairly certain he lived and fairly certain when he lived, which is around the 1st century in the Common Era. But according to legend, the Buddha concealed the Prajnaparamita teachings at the bottom of the great ocean in the realm of the Nagas, which is the snakes, legendary mythical snakes, not actual physical snakes. And then Nagarjuna was the one who retrieved these teachings, because it was only by this time that the Buddhist assembly was actually qualified to receive these teachings. This was called the 2nd turning of the wheel. So what the Mahayana says is the 1st turning of the wheel was the deer park at Benares. And if you know Buddhist iconography, there's a famous Buddhist icon, which is the deers kneeling down in front of the wheel of the Dharma. And that represents the Buddha's initial teaching at the deer park at Benares after he had been enlightened. And when those first disciples, his first 5 disciples gathered around him, and he enunciated the Buddhist path. So it was the 1st turning of the wheel. But then the Mahayanas, at this stage, Nagarjuna and the people who brought these texts to the world would maybe not call themselves the Mahayana. They didn't see themselves as being a schism or a separate group. This is what they thought was the true intent of the teaching. They said that after a period of some hundreds of years, these teachings had been concealed and they were retrieved by Nagarjuna, and then the world, or the followers of the Buddha, were ready to hear them. So that was the second turning of the wheel. So the first turning was the Diyapaka Benaris. The second turning was the revelation of the Prajna Paramita teachings. And then there was a third turning, which was the mind-only teachings that came several hundred years later. And so that's, to answer your question, in a way, that's the way the Buddhist tradition rationalized the fact that there were these really what amounts to new developments, saying, look, they're not new. The Buddha actually knew all of this, but you weren't ready to hear them yet. So these new teachers have come along, which, the new teachings have been revealed. And you see, you find that in Tibetan traditions as well, when they say there are hidden teachings that have been made available for subsequent generations when people are ready to hear them. So that's part of this whole more expansive kind of view that the Mahayanists have. They've got a much, I think the word is, I suppose one word they use is liberal or progressive. They have a much kind of less traditionalist attitude towards the nature of spiritual truth. It's something which can, present itself in all different kinds of ways and adapt itself to all different types of circumstances and different kinds of ideas. That's one of the reasons that Mahayana spread so widely, because I feel as though it's the Theravada cultures are very much more, the cultural form is very much, it relies a lot more on maintaining the original model of the wandering monastic and the agrarian society that feeds and that sort of thing. Because Mahayanists tend to be able to adapt to all different kinds of circumstances because they have a much more, I suppose, flexible type of mindset. So these little slides I put, this slide here is a bit more about the distinction between, now the way that had been written, I find a lot of these slides, you can find a lot of this material nowadays online. When I found this one, it said Hinayana and Mahayana, which I didn't want to say that for the reasons I explained, because I do think that the terminology is a bit, it's disparaging towards the traditional teachings. So the early Buddhist texts were the teachings of the elders. That's what Theravada means. The Mahayana said, well, it's the same, we're teaching the same, but it's in the spirit. It's not necessarily the word. That's, as a Christian saying, the word kills, the spirit gives life. The small vehicle was the concern with individual liberation. The large vehicle was concerned with the liberation of all mankind. And this is something else I should mention here, is that in the early Buddhist texts, it was very much the Buddha, if you go back and look at his texts, he's very much talking to monastics who have renounced their home and everything. They've given themselves totally to the Buddhist path. They've renounced the world. Whereas the Mahayana, because they have this view of the Buddha as being a transcendent being, then the Buddha's grace, the idea of grace, which is similar in some ways to the Christian concept, starts to become a reality. And in fact, I'm going to say, yes, a little later on, I want to say a little bit more about that, because that's very important in things like Pure Land Buddhism, which is a very influential and probably the largest form of Buddhism in the parts of Japan and China. So on the left hand, you see the key virtue is wisdom in the old school, and in the Mahayana, the key virtue is compassion, karuna or bodhicitta. In the old school, the religion is primarily monastic, whereas in the new Mahayana idea, it's also a monastic vocation, a layperson vocation, I should say. In fact, there's a very famous Mahayana scripture called the Vimala Kirti, which is the tale of a very wealthy silk merchant who has a family and daughters and a house and all that sort of thing. And the Buddha sends his disciples, Sariputra and Moggallana and all of them, off to debate Vimalakirti on the nature of true realization. And they're all scared of him because he knows it better than they do, even though he's a layman. And that sort of signifies how it was the conception of the Buddhist life started to change from being one where it was centered on this renunciate community to the possibility of enlightenment in household life, which at the time again was radical. I suppose it should be. We should acknowledge the fact that in some respects Mahayana was a radical movement, and is a radical movement. So let's put that on the table. Right. I think the rest of those I don't really need to explain so much. I think they're all fairly self-evident. Samsara and nirvana are no longer seen in the early schools. They were seen as being completely separate realms of existence, whereas the Mahayana view is very much more subtle than that. It's as if there aren't really two different worlds or realms called samsara and nirvana. Really, it's all one realm, and it depends on how you relate to it, whether it's painful or not. So if you grasp and cling, it's samsara, and if you utterly release from it, then the same situation is nirvana. It's not as if there are two different worlds. And there's actually a beautiful saying in the Tibetan Buddhism that samsara is nirvana grasped, whereas nirvana is samsara released. It's a beautiful thing.
I'm curious as to whether, like, is there arahan, the idea of arahan in Mahayana? So, like, how do you achieve is there a goal as enlightenment?
There is, but the goal is like the enlightenment of all beings. There's a saying I actually found. I'll give you this saying that I found in the Dalai Lama said. This Dalai Lama came out with a statement. This is around the time about a decade ago, when he's talking about the conditions for the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, because there's a bit of politics, as you know. The Chinese are declaring they have a stake in which his reincarnation will be. So he wrote this essay on the Tibetan view, and I'll read this to you. It's not on the screen, but I think it's important to help answer your question. There are two ways in which someone can take rebirth after death. Rebirth under the sway of karma and destructive emotions, and rebirth through the power of compassion and prayer. Regarding the first, due to ignorance, negative and positive karma are created, and their imprints remain on the consciousness. These are reactivated through craving and grasping, propelling us to the next life. On the other hand, superior bodhisattvas who have attained the path of seeing are not reborn through the force of their karma and destructive emotions, but due to the power of their compassion for sentient beings and based on their prayers to benefit others. They are able to choose the place and time of birth as well as their future parents. Such a rebirth, which is solely for the benefit of others, is rebirth through the force of compassion, which I thought was a very profound statement, because it really changes the whole, like, how shall I say, orientation of, if you could imagine yourself, I suppose all of us at every moment, we can say, well, either we're being forced to be here because it's bad karma, or we could be here to benefit others. And really, we have in our power to adopt that attitude, no matter what our circumstances, really. So I don't think it's a hard and fast distinction, in the sense that I don't think the Mahayana path is like, how shall we say, disparaging or putting down the idea of arhatship. I just feel as though they have a different motivation, if you like, for attaining it. The motivation is to benefit everyone. And so in that respect, it's not something they just do for their own enlightenment, but it's for the enlightenment of all beings. So I'd like to see it as being continuous with it, and not as like a disruption or separate from it. Maybe like even a larger appreciation or a larger view of the same basic idea is the way I would like to see it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, actually, when I was doing my research, I found an interesting paper about the fact that originally the vocation, the career of the bodhisattva was very understood in early Buddhism as a very, very difficult path to attain. And it was said in the original tradition, and we should always respect the original tradition because it's their tradition, it was said that it was only possible if you took the bodhisattva vows in the presence of an actual Buddha. It wasn't something you could casually just decide to do. And it wasn't something that was conferred lightly, or it was easy to walk this path. And I read this very interesting anecdote that Ajahn Mun, who was one of the very well-known forest monks of the Theravada tradition, he felt at some stage in his career as if his realization was being inhibited by the bodhisattva aspiration, because it was too impossible for him to realize. He said, if I'm going to try and be a bodhisattva, I know I'm going to be trapped. I'm not trapped, but I'm going to be in, like samsara for aeons of lifetimes. I'm not ready for this. So he recalibrated his intention to, return to the arhat path. So, these are very deep. Like me personally, it's worlds away from my experience or my station or anything like that. I can only go on what I read about these heroic individuals who actually understand and practice these things. So, yeah, I don't see there as being so much a conflict between those two ideals, but I just feel as though, as I say, they're reorientated in some ways. So there's this beautiful figure you'll see in East Asian iconography of the figure of Prajnaparamita as a goddess, or as a female deity. She's always depicted in these forms as being serene, still, and beautiful. And it's the Prajnaparamita is the mother of the Tathagatas. So it's the source of the wisdom of the Buddhas, is this supreme wisdom, Prajnaparamita, which has always struck me as a beautiful idea. And in fact, one of the Buddhist studies scholars I studied, Edward Konza, who's a great German Buddhologist, said that really this is like a universal archetype, because in the West it's Sophia. Sophia is the goddess of wisdom in the West, and there are these beautiful temples or churches dedicated to Sophia, Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, and the Prajnaparamita and Sophia really are like two faces of the spirit of wisdom, if you like. And that always meant a lot. It's always really resonated with me, that sense. I think also the figure of Kuan Yin is related to that as well. It's like, yeah, it's always meant a lot to me. Oh, I'm not going to go through that slide. So this is, I think I'm probably getting close to as much information as I want to try and impart, because it wasn't until I started talking about this topic again until I realized what a big topic it is, and I don't want to overwhelm you with it, because there are a lot of big ideas in this, but this was the kind of the change from the Theravada to the Mahayana. They have this cosmic idea. Eventually, you'll find in these allusions in some of the Tibetan and Chinese scriptures that there are Buddhas on other worlds. They literally believe in cosmic civilization, which I think is from the quite nothing thought that this is coming out of like, what we call ancient Asia, like hundreds or thousands of years ago. They have these ideas that Buddhism might be part of a cosmic civilization and not just down here on this little planet Earth. They have a very big view of the world. And the Buddhas in that are sort of these sort of celestial beings who incarnate at very special times in order to, for the benefit of mankind. So that's the Mahayana kind of view. What else have I got here? Oh, I don't think I'm going to go into that at the moment. There's a lot of doctrinal material to talk about, but I just feel as though I might be overdoing it if I branch into that. How do we feel about that so far? Yeah, good. Because I just don't know what, if I just should keep going with it at the moment. I just see what other slides I've got. Just let me back out of here so I can just have a look at my, oh yeah, I'll say something about this. This is a good thing to, yes, I know, I know what I can do here, right. Okay, emptiness 101. We've already seen, first of all, the big change in emphasis from the arahat ideal to the bodhisattva. And it was also the change from body wisdom, which is still a very good thing, but to compassion, bodhicitta, which is wisdom mind. The thing which is often associated with the Mahayana Buddhists is this teaching of shunyata, one of those mysterious Oriental words that you will hear. And if you spend time, going to Tibetan teaching centers, they talk a lot about shunyata. So we should say something about it, but I'll preface that with the fact that it's a very easy thing to misunderstand. And I'm not saying that as like an authority, but they do warn in the scriptures themselves, the idea of emptiness has to be grasped correctly. Otherwise, it's poisonous, like a snake. You pick up a snake, you have to grab it right behind the head. If you try and hold it by the tail, it'll bite you. Because it's very important to understand what they're trying to convey, what the Buddha is trying to convey with the idea of emptiness. And the thing about the idea of emptiness is a lovely essay on the Access to Insight site, which is by Theravada, not by Mahayana. And it's the one I always start with when I try to talk to anybody about emptiness, because it actually makes it very simple. Because how he starts it is like this. He says, emptiness is a mode of perception, a way of looking at experience. It adds nothing to and takes nothing away from the raw data of physical and mental events. You look at events in the mind and the senses with no thought as to whether there's something behind them. So that's the essence of mindfulness, really, as you all know from practicing mindfulness. Like when you're on the mat, things start to build up, like all of the thoughts want to lead you astray, and the things that what was that thing I had to do? Oh, that's right, I remember, and so forth. And you start to go down that road of that elaboration of internal dialogue, and then you're caught up in it, and that becomes your entire internal world. So this emptiness perception is really a way of returning to the breath all of the time in day-to-day and moment-by-moment awareness. So that this is why emptiness is not a theory. And people make it sound like it's this great mysterious thing, but emptiness is really seeing through your internal dialogue to a large degree, and also it's seeing through the importance that you attribute to stuff. And like, you've got to remember that this was addressed to a monastic order who had basically renounced most of their stuff. Like they'd given up children and home and titles, possessions, that sort of thing. So my take on emptiness is that it teaches them to realize that all of these things which they're attached to, which they think are going to bring them joy, are always transient. And they're going to end up being disappointing because they have the three marks. They're not self, they're unsatisfactory, and they're dukkha, anatta, anicca. All experiences and all phenomena are like that. They're empty of anything intrinsically real or important. So that's my very preliminary and early take on the teaching of shunyata. Now, the reason it gets associated with the Mahayana in particular is because by the time the Mahayana started to develop, which is probably 500 to 1,000 years after the Buddha's parinirvana, there had been, as we saw with that slide with all the schools, all of the proliferating schools, there was a huge amount of text material, a lot of scholastic information, and in some ways the Buddhist theory had become like this thick forest of concepts, and they'd really become distanced from the really simple, powerful, penetrating insight of the Buddha into non-attachment and renunciation. So when the Mahayana Nagarjuna came along, he basically critiqued all of these elaborate philosophies that have been developed by the Buddha. But in order to understand it, though, it's quite a difficult subject. It's not the kind of thing, Nagarjuna is not for beginners, put it that way. And the reason why is because you need to understand what it is that he's talking about. And what he's talking about is all of the various Buddhist movements and also Hindu philosophers that had come between the time of the Buddha and himself. So he's turning around and critiquing all of that. And really, that's why he's called the second Buddha, because he's bringing the mind back all the time to the fundamental realization of emptiness, which is the thing which dissolves attachment to all sorts of possessions and ideas and ideologies. that was the emptiness of all dharmas, because the dharmas that they're talking about is the elaborate abhidharma that they had developed. And so his was a very critical and kind of, how shall we say, it's like a mental type of ascetic view. Realizing emptiness then becomes the path itself, because that's realizing not unattachment and non-attachment, which you can really only learn that by meditation, because that is what it's like, the heart of meditation. Because again, it's like when you're sitting in meditation and the mind keeps coming, you keep bringing the mind back to the breath and back to the breath and back to the breath, and not letting it develop into all of these internal forests and thickets of ideas and all of the attachments that go with that. Easier said than done, I know. Because a lot of those attachments are very, very persistent, and they manifest in all different, they manifest as all the problems we've got. Any individual has to, like they have their whole list of them. So it's not as if one can just simply sprinkle this magic powder on them and make them all disappear. No, it takes really persistent and deep insight. So that's kind of like a, how shall we say, a simple intro to the idea of the teaching of Shunyata, but I wouldn't by any means, like, it's something you needs to be investigated. And it's always very much associated with, I suppose, all forms of Tibetan and all forms of Mahayana, like Zen teachings, and they all have, actually, there's the monastery down at Bandanoon called Sunataram Forest Monastery. Yes, that's Suna is it. It's emptiness Taram Forest Monastery. So that's, again, it's a fundamental idea in Buddhism. And like emptiness, bodhisattva, all of the things you find in the Mahayana, they're all there in the original teachings. But the way the Mahayana, how shall we say, elaborated them and reframed them, that's what made them different. It's what made the distinctive sort of difference. See what other slides I've got here. Oh yeah, I wanted to say something about, I did say in my preamble that I was going to say something about current actual schools of Buddhism rather than just all this theoretical academic stuff. So during the last couple of years, when I started going to a Pure Land service myself in Sydney, because I wanted to find a Buddhist group that I could, like a service I could go to. And so I went to a place which was Jodo Shinchu school in, I'll tell you a bit more about this particular one. But getting back to the narrative, as we saw before, the idea of the Buddha was, how should we say, made more like cosmic by the Mahayana. And also there was this idea that the Buddha's powers were such that they could assist all beings in all directions, like all over the universe, through their vow to help us all. So this is where faith in Amida Buddha is a legendary form of the Buddha, and Amida means limitless or boundless. And this particular manifestation of the Buddha took this vow that no being who said his name would be abandoned. I'll get to that question very shortly. So Amida, the emphasis in Pure Land Buddhism, which is very popular in China and Japan. In fact, really, it's kind of like, I suppose you could say from an academic viewpoint, it's like the popular level of Buddhism in most of the East is in Amida. And so the faith is like the name of the Amida. If you say the Nembutsu, in fact, not even very often or very much, just sometimes, then you'll be reborn in the Pure Land, which is a certain path to Nirvana. So this was all thrashed out during the 11th and 12th century by two priests in Japan called Honen and Shinran, who are very famous in Japan. And all you need to say is Namu Amida Butsu. And repeating that formula can bring nirvana. So it's very similar in some ways to popular Christianity, I suppose. But at the same time, the background belief system is very different, because obviously it's Buddhist.